Hello viewers, welcome to week 2, lecture 5 of Swayam course on 20th century literary criticism and theory part 1. I am Ashish Kumar Pathak, assistant professor, Department of English, Banaras Hindu University. In this lecture, I am going to talk about another prominent member of new criticism, Clint Brooks. So here we will be talking about Brooks's concept of paradox or irony in detail. We will also be talking about various texts, various poets that he undertakes for elaborating this concept of paradox or irony in a literary work. So Clint Brooks is one of the leading critics of the group called the New Critics in USA, who laid emphasis on the close reading of the text. He was educated at Vanderbilt and Tulane and taught at Louisiana State University from 1932 to 1937. So we can see that why this movement is called Anglo-American criticism, because most of the critics are either born in the US and largely they are born in the US, and there is a shifting of their identities and locations between the two places, right? So therefore it is called Anglo-American New Criticism. Brooks was a student of J.C. Ransom, whom we have already talked about in detail in the previous lectures. Ransom, and in a way he was a pioneer of new criticism of USA during the 1930s. He co-edited with Robert Penn Warren Southern Review, another very important magazine which was very instrumental in disseminating the ideas of new criticism. His important works are Modern Poetry and Tradition, that was in 1939, The Well-Wrought Urn, that he wrote, then with R.P. Warren, he wrote Understanding Poetry and Understanding Fiction. His Understanding Drama came out in 1947, that he wrote with Robert Hillman. So, Clint Brooks has his own theory of poetry. He has taken Richardson's terminology and transformed it into a clear system of depriving it of its psychological presuppositions. It allows him to analyze poems as structure of tensions, in other words, of paradox and ironies. Ren Welek makes an interesting observation on this point. He says, paradox and irony with Brooks are terms used very broadly. Irony is not the opposite of an overt statement, but a general term for the kind of qualification which various elements in context receive from the context. It indicates the recognition of incongruities, the ambiguity, the union of opposites that Brooks finds in all good, that is complex poetry. Poetry must be ironic in the sense of being able to withstand ironic contemplation. The method no doubt works best when applied to Donne or Shakespeare, Eliot or Yeats, but in The Well-Wrought Urn, a collection of analysis of poems, Brooks showed that even Wordsworth and Tennyson and Gray and Pope yield to this kind of technique. Brooks advances a significant idea in The Well-Wrought Urn that every poem is built upon an irony or paradox. The language of paradox forms the first chapter of this book. So, according to Brooks, the various elements of poetry, noble thoughts, vivid images, words, and melodious sounds, rhythmic movements, and well-chosen rhyme are not poetic in themselves. Their aggregate is also not poetic in itself. He is of the opinion that the aggregate of dictionary definitions of the words of which the poem is made up, with all types of rules of grammar and syntax, will not lead us anywhere close to the real meaning of the poem, because the real meaning is hidden behind different types of irony, paradox, ambiguity, and the devices of evocation of something that lies dormant in our minds. Brooks, like other new critics, cuts off the poem from both the reader and the writer. So, The Language of Paradox is a seminal essay on new criticism. Brooks maintains that paradox is the language appropriate and inevitable to poetry. He distinguishes the language of poetry from the language of science. He takes some of the poems of Donne, Gray, Wordsworth, Yeats to show how paradox and irony heighten the underlying situations in these poems. Following I.A. Richards, Brooks makes a twofold division of language into scientific and poetic. Moreover, he maintains a distinction between two kinds of meanings, denotative and connotative. Brooks examines the poems of Wordsworth, Pope, Gray, Donne, and Shakespeare to show how the underlying paradox helps to explain the meaning. According to him, Wordsworth's sonnet composed upon Westminster's Bridge, the underlying paradox is to take the London house to be asleep. In order, the word lacks all activities. So he goes on to say, for example, if we look at that poem composed on the Westminster Bridge, the central paradox is to consider the London house asleep. For example, if we read the poem Message, so there we find that he is describing London in the morning hours, and what he says that he looks at that city and he says that this is amazing, its peace and a kind of spiritual energy that he finds in that city. What is the irony here is that, London is the hub of industrialism, right? It was a place always abuzz with activities, right? But in the morning hours, he finds that as if all might of God, a strange kind of spiritual energy can be found in the site of that city. Now, the paradox lies in the fact that, in a place which is the center of industrialism, where, materialistic thoughts and materialistic ideas drive and govern the lives of people, at that place, imagining this kind of spiritual energy. So he says that there lies the paradox, and there we can see that how this paradox or irony becomes the central principle of poetry, right? So for instance, London is foregrounded as a natural landscape and as an artificial marvel. The lack of activities in the houses in the early hours of the morning metaphorically means the death of these houses, but still he is capable of imagining a kind of energy, life, the symbol of life, which can be associated with houses which are seen as sleeping. For example, if we another instance that how paradox or irony becomes the central feature, if we look at the very idea of the lyrical ballads, he says that if we read the preface, there Wordsworth says that he is going to write about the ordinary people and he is going to give them a touch of extraordinariness, or what we say that how he says that he is going to write about the natural objects, but he is going to assign a supernatural quality to those natural objects. So, Brooks is hinting in that direction that this paradox is lying at the very conception of this collection of poetry that is known as the lyrical ballads. Further, he takes up Wordsworth's idea of language, right? That how he is going to experience or going to express the experience of the rustic people, how he is going to use prosaic language for that. So paradox is also lying there, because there Wordsworth is going to talk about these people in a poetic way, right? So this paradox between poetry and prose, it creates a kind of ironic situation. Similarly, in the previous work, in the previous point that I made, that how between natural and supernaturalism. To understand the point, we can refer to that book by M.H. Abrams, right? So Brooke further claims that paradox is inherent in Wordsworth's conscious attempt to show the audience that the common was really uncommon, the prosaic was really poetic. So for Brooks, romantic paradoxes are concerned with showing off the familiar world in an unfamiliar light, right? If the familiar world in the new light, because of the romantic preoccupation with wonder, the neoclassical poets, according to Brooks, use paradox for much the same reason, right? So he goes on to quote from the neoclassical writers, and he shows that if you look at the functioning of thoughts of these neoclassical writers, even on the language, on the level of language, on the level of ideas, this paradox is quite clear. And he quotes from Pope's famous The Essay on Man, right, to prove this point. He says, quote, "In doubt his mind or body to prefer, born but to die, and reasoning but to err, alike in ignorance his reason such, whether he thinks too little or too much, created half to rise and half to fall, great Lord of all things, yet prey to all, sole fudge of truth, in endless error hurled, the glory, gist, and riddle of the world." So if we read these lines, the paradox of humanity is well captured by Pope. Similarly, he quotes from the elegy written in a country churchyard by Gray: "Can storied urn or animated bust, back to its mention, call the fleeting breath? Can honor's voice provoke the silent dust, or flattery soothe the dull cold ear of death?" Right. So here we find that how paradox says spring from the very nature of the poet's language. It is a language in which connotations play a great part as denotations. The dictionary meaning is often violated by connotative meaning, for the poet works by contradictions and qualification. Analogy is the tool with which the poet proceeds in his work, right? So he says that Clint Brooks makes an in-depth study of John Donne's canonization to show how a poet indulges in paradox, to depict human love with a greater vigor and strength. The paradoxes arise out of the poet's daring treatment of profane love as if it were divine love. So Brooks writes, "The canonization is not that of a pair of holy anchorites who have renounced the world and the flesh. The hermitage of each is the other's body, but they do renounce the world, and so their title to sainthood is cunningly argued." The poem then is a parody of Christian sainthood, but it is an intensely serious parody of a sort that modern man, habituated as he to an easy yes or no, can hardly understand. So the conflict between the real world and the lover's world continues throughout the poem, but the lover's torment does not affect the real world. What merchant ships have my signs drowned? The conflict is more pronounced in the fourth stanza. So it is touched on in the fourth stanza. in the contrast between the word chronicle, which suggests secular history with its pomp and magnificence, the history of kings and princes, and the word sonnets with its suggestion of trivial and precious intricacy. Right. So, further, in Donne's love poetry, one is a key word. It occurs in several poems. He believed that lovers have a world. Brooks explains at length uh, his point of view as follows. The comparison of the lovers to the phoenix is very skillfully related to the two earlier comparisons, that in which the lovers are like burning tapers, and that in which they are like the eagle and the dove. The phoenix comparison gathers up both. The phoenix is a bird, and like tapers, it burns. We have a selected series of items. The phoenix figures seems to come out in a natural stream of association. Call us what you will, the lover says, and rattles off in his desperation of the first comparisons that occur to him. The comparison to the phoenix seems thus merely another outlandish one, the most outrageous of all. But it is this fantastic one, stumbled over apparently in his haste, that the poet goes on to develop. So it really describes the lovers best and justifies their renunciation. For the phoenix is not two but one. We two being one are it, and it burns not like taper at its own low cost, but to live again. Its death is life, we dying and rise the same. So the poet literally justifies the fantastic assertion. In the 16th and 17th centuries, to die means to experience the consummation of the act of love. The lovers after the act are the same. Their love is not exhausted in mere lust. This is their title to canonization. So their love is like phoenix. So here we find that how paradox forms the bedrock of the poem. If paradox is taken out, the poem will lose its significance. After examining the canonization, Donne turns to Shakespeare's poem, The Phoenix and the Turtle, to show how paradox works here. Donne feels that paradox is the language appropriate to poetry. Well, the question that haunts us after reading Clint Brooks' essay are, to say the least, baffling. It is true that always the language of poetry is the language of paradox. We should ask this question. I think no. I believe that to evaluate a work of art only in terms of paradox involves a risk. For the poems do not contain paradox. Instead of the critical monism of the new critics, one has to make a pluralistic approach to understand a work of art. Paradox is one of several rhetoric figures of speech, and one will do well to search for terms such as irony, tension, ambiguity to understand a poem correctly. Right. So now let us quickly move to Allen Tate, who is also a new critic, and his reactionary essays on poetry and ideas is one of his major critical works. As we know that how Tate has coined the terms tension, to describe what he calls the common quality of good poetry. His influential essay, Tension in Poetry, is included in his book, The Man of Letters in Modern World, which deals with tension as the life of a poem. It reveals Tate's view that a good poem is one in which extension and intention are always in a state of flux. Here also, like Ransom has talked about structure and texture, logical meaning and local meaning. Similarly, Tate is also talking about extension and intention, where by extension he means the literal meaning or what is called denotative meaning, and by intention he means connotative meaning or suggested meaning, right? So, this literal meaning and suggestive meaning, there is an interplay between them, and out of this interplay a tension is created, and that tension is perceived as the energy which animates a poem, right? So, tension, so in the first part of this essay he deals with the fallacy of communication in poetry. Mass language, says Tate, is the medium of communication. Tate illustrates the point with some examples. The first example is Justice Denied in Massachusetts, a poem by Miss Millene. So, the poem is an example of the fallacy of communication is poetry because it is obscure. The poem makes sense only for those who share the feelings of the poet or her contemporaries. Another example of obscurity is found in the poem The Vine by James Thomson. The language here appeals to an affective state. It does not have a coherent literal and implied meaning. Whereas Tate considers the vine to be a failure in denotation. He finds Abraham Cowley's Hymn to Light to be a failure in connotation. In Cowley's poem, the connotation of violet, swaddling bands and light give us a group of images. We can appreciate them only if we forget the denotative meaning of the term. The poet uses violets, dappers, light without referring to the denotative aspect at all. So, for Tate, a good poetry is a unity of all meanings from the furthest extremes of intention and extension. He says, the reader's recognition of the action of this unified meaning is the gift of experience, culture and humanism. The powers of discrimination here are not deductive powers but total human powers. In the second part of this essay, he defines tension in poetry and explains its importance. For tension denotes the relationship between denotative and connotative meanings of a poem. He believes that tension constitutes the life force of the poem. He quotes the gold conceit from Donne's love lyric, A Valediction Forbidding Morning, to illustrate his idea of tension. Here the poet compares the souls of lovers and their unity with the uniqueness of gold. The soul is non-spatial. The poet uses a special image, that is gold, to contradict it. However, the denotation of the gold contains the full meaning of the passage. Extension and intention are here enriching each other. Further, in the third part of this essay, he, takes examples from Dante's Divine Comedy, and he refers to Dante's meeting of two illicit lovers, Paolo and Francesca, whirling in a high wind in the second circle of hell. The wind is the symbol of lust. When Francesca speaks to the poet, the wind dies down. She tells him where she was born. The town where I was born sits on a shore, whither to pour descends to be at peace, together with the streams that follow him. Here the literal meaning is that she was born in a town on the seashore and the river Po falls along with tributaries. But the metaphor is more than just the description of the place. Dante describes the streams of the river as chasing the Po down to the sea. Francesca has told Dante where she lives using lucid language, but has told him more than that. She fuses herself with the river Po where she was born. So in this way, Francesca has become one with her lover, her lust. She has become absorbed by the sin of lust. She becomes the sin. So the wind of lust is an image. It is visual as well as auditory image. Francesca is heard by the poet when the hissing sound of the wind dies down. Thus we see and hear the sin. Both intention and extension become one here. Tate regards these examples of tension in poetry. So you have to follow this assignment for week 2. What constitutes Lewis's The Great Tradition? Answer in 100 words. Second, read J.C. Ransom's essay, Criticism, INC. Third, read about impressionistic and expressive theories of literature. Fourth, write short notes on irony, paradox, ambiguity, and texture in 50 words each. And answer the question, why new critics like Donne so much? So with this discussion, dear viewers, I come to the end of this lecture. In this lecture, I have talked about Cleanth Brooks, his idea of paradox and irony, and how it is elaborated in his analysis of various poems. And we have talked about Tait's concept of tension. Thank you.